Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, Beth Chats Books. So, I have got back from Iceland. This week I went from the Saturday to the Tuesday to Iceland with Paul. So I'm using my leftover winter gear coming back. So I didn't film anything for that period of time. In between that I had a few days off before we went away that I took with annual leave. So I read a few books and I thought every so often I personally quite like to let you guys know what I've read and do mini kind of wrap-ups, a bit like people do the kind of Friday reads, but I don't read that many books in a week to constitute a Friday reads. But every so often when I've got a little pile of read books, I like to tell you guys, especially because I'm using the library a lot more, then I kind of feel like once I've given you that batch, I can take them back to the library and move on to the still to be read books. So I don't know if you guys are enjoying that at the moment, the fact that I kind of do recent reads as my main style of video at the moment. But it's what I'm enjoying cathartically to kind of process the books, because I quite like, after I've read them while they're still fresh, to kind of do my little bit of wrap up and discussion on them, because there's no point waiting until I've finished all 8 or 6 books I take out at a time from the library, because I feel like it gives you less of an authentic view of how I felt about them. But I have been playing around my mind with a few things I would like to do in the coming year, and I'm working on a micro project which I mentioned in my last video, which is I'm planning to do a year of challenging reads next year. So I want to do a TBR of a list of 12 books, so one for every month, of books that I consider challenging. So it's quite loose, that term, and the reason I've made it quite loose is because there's a mixture of books that frighten me that I really want to read. For example, I've always wanted to read American Psycho and Silence of the Lambs and some Stephen King, because everybody raves about him here on BookTube. But those things have kind of terrified me madly because it's not a genre I feel very confident about, and I am a bit of a scaredy cat. But on the other side to that word challenging, there are quite a lot of classics I still have on my shelves. For example, a lot of Dickens. David Copperfield is one example that is huge. It's just massive. And when I was watching videos of people's Victobers recently, a lot of people mentioned how books like that, Dickens and other intimidating looking Victorian literature, was really very rewarding. So I have things like Anna Karenina and things like that. So a few of those titles that I've just mentioned will be on this list that I'm going to compile of 12. So what I'm going to do, and I'll do a video where I tell you about all those books and I kind of compile them, get them, and kind of show you that TBR in maybe January once we've got to the new year, or maybe in December as a booster of what I'm going to do. So I'm going to do 12 that I ultimately really want to read this coming year, 2020, and that they've been on my TBR for a while. And then I might do a second pile of 12 of even better ifs, so my aspirational, if I could exceed my target of the 12, of another 12 that have also been on my list, because there are quite a lot of these challenging reads. So I just thought I'd explain it briefly here, so that in a future video I can go into a bit of detail about it and you know what I'm talking about. But without further ado, I'm just going to go into some of the books that I've recently finished reading. So, when you last saw me, I was reading Silkworm. Well, technically when you last saw me, my tag video would come up, but the last time we talked about books, I was reading the Silkworm and I was about 40 pages in. That was around 500 to 600 pages. It was 500 odd. So it's quite a chunky book. But I have finished it, and I did give it around 4 out of 5 stars. So the story was very different than A Cuckoo's Calling, and I quite liked that. So Robert Galbraith has done 4 main books in the series, which is J.K. Rowling's pseudonym, and that is, let's hope I get this right, A Cuckoo's Calling, Silkworm, Careers of Evil, and the Lethal, I always want to say weapon, but it's not, it's the Lethal something beginning with W. Anywho, I'm not going to linger on that. So I'm up to Silkworm, the second book. So this, yes, was very different to A Cuckoo's Calling. It revolved around a very sudden and unusual death of an author called Owen Quinn. Now, Owen Quinn wasn't very famous in literary circles, but he was kind of infamous for his very dark, gruesome, kind of warped literature that was semi-fantasy, but often was a little bit on the grotesque side. So in the story, he ends up dying exactly how his latest book has predicted his main protagonist had died in the book. So that's all I'm going to say, because I don't want to give too much away on that one. Obviously, these books have been floating around a while as well, so I know a lot of people have already read them. I really enjoy the Cormoran Strike books. I think Cormoran is a really interesting character. He's really funny. I really like Robin and Cormoran's dynamic, and how in this book they've developed more into a respect level. Cormoran is seeing Robin's potential as his kind of sidekick in all this finding out who done it kind of stuff. This one was slightly more intense than A Cuckoo's Calling, because the nature of the kind of writing Owen Quinn was known for, the kind of really grotesque murder, in comparison to Lula Landry's death in A Cuckoo's Calling, that was rather tame in comparison. So this was a lot more gruesome, a lot more intense. When I was in Iceland, I saw some covers for these books in a Icelandic bookshop, and I hadn't really realised that a good few years ago there had been a BBC series on these books. And I was a little bit frustrated, because on the cover it has a pretty girl and a pretty man, toy boy, very smooth looking, very BBC-esque. And I think that's really not my reading experience. Cormoran is not a beautiful man in the books. I feel like they probably just tried to tart up these two characters and make them more TV beautiful. So that kind of annoyed me, because I thought, well, that's not how I view Cormoran's little world. But aside from that, really enjoyed the book, but it was a lot more dark and depressing than the first one, so I wouldn't give it the full 5 stars like I did with Cuckoo's Calling, because the writing is really easy to get through, considering it's over 500 pages. It was a pleasurable read, but it goes into quite a lot of grim detail of different ways that people can hurt one another, which is a little bit intense, but very enjoyable. And J.K. Rowling knows exactly what she's doing. It's a very smart book, and I'm going to continue on with the series, so there's that one. And then the next book I read was Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. So this book follows Daisy Jones and the Six. So the Six are a group of individuals who have started up a band, and at the same time they kind of get a record label deal as Daisy Jones does. So it's set in the US. I believe it's kind of California-esque, but obviously they end up going on tours and they go all over America, so it's not situated in one place, or kind of LA and things like that. And so Billy is the lead singer of the band The Six, and then they end up doing a track with Daisy, which then becomes very famous, and it gets them both lots of sales, and slowly their managers and the producers and things like that start to get Daisy Jones and the Six to conglomerate into one big group because of the commercial potential of both of them together. So I know that lots of people say this is loosely based on Fleetwood Mac, and there are some will they won't they bits of romance going on that is very indicative of Fleetwood Mac, as well as other bands like ABBA, where people kind of met through the band, had relationships through the band, and quite bad breakups through the band. So Daisy and Billy have this continuous will they won't they element, and then Billy's brother Graham has a relationship on and off with Karen, who is the keyboardist. I don't know if I'm saying that right, of the band. So Daisy and Billy have these quite passionate rows, and they have these quite intense songs that they perform and all that. So I really liked the style. The book is kind of written in bulk paragraphs with the name of the person. So example, who's talking, whether it's Graham, Billy, Daisy, Billy's wife Camilla. And then it's kind of written in a style almost as if you could see that they've asked them questions, and it's kind of mock documentary style of almost the bulk text of what an interviewer's asked and what they've received. So it doesn't have direct questions in it, but the form is kind of set out as those bulk paragraphs that you'd see if you almost had a script from an interview when you were interviewing a celebrity of what they've said. It's very funny at parts because there's elements of a certain situation or a certain concert that they were at. And because there's so many characters who belong to that band, they all have a very different perception of what happened on that night. So that was fun, and I thought the style was unique and quite fun and enjoyable. However, I think the concept ran out of steam towards the end. The structure and form can only go so far before it kind of traps itself in the loop, and I think that happened. It started to get a little bit long-winded. A lot of the characters are very self-indulgent, which obviously a big band would be. All the egos fighting against each other, I get that concept. But Billy and Camilla, Billy was married to Camilla, and the way he treats her and then what she puts up with is a little bit tiresome to read as a woman. You kind of think, I would have just got gone. And it makes you kind of question Camilla sometimes, because she's presented in the novel as this saint who sticks by him, but she had a high quality of life through his fame, so that's a bit problematic. And Billy and Daisy both have addiction issues, and there's very self-indulgent paragraphs about that. Daisy in particular is, in the end, Billy kind of tries to work on his demons and Daisy kind of doesn't, and Daisy's almost presented as more respected for that. All the other characters constantly sing her praises, how beautiful she is, even when she's being a bit of a diva, and so obviously that was a bit tiresome to read as well. So I didn't really love any of the characters, and I didn't really end up loving it overall. I enjoyed it. It's a very much kind of a palate cleansing read if you enjoy those kind of fun escapist kind of books, but it didn't really overall do much for me. It didn't have a point to prove. I think it was just an experimental style really, and it doesn't have anything more deeper than that throughout the whole kind of ensemble of the novel. So I just gave it a 3.5. And then the next one I read was Machines Like Me by Ian McEwan. So this is one of his most recent novels. I know that Ian McEwan's The Cockroach, which is a inspired novella of Kafka's Metamorphosis, is out in Waterstones and all the bookshelves. I see it all the time when I'm out and about. But this is his kind of latest novel. This was brought out this year. So I was really interested to see where this would go, because I've recently read Jeanette Winterson's Frankenstein, and it seems to be quite popular, particularly this year, to bring out novels that focus around AI, artificial intelligence, and kind of technology and where we're going. So this book revolves around an alternative 1980s in London, where robots are just starting to come into the kind of general sphere. So domestic robots, those who can do all your cleaning and your cooking, but they also have tried to produce an artificial kind of consciousness with them so they can have conversations with you. And unlike Frankenstein, they are not developed solely for the purpose of sex for individuals, but you can have sex with these robots, which I will kind of briefly touch upon in a second. So this is quite a full-packed novel. I believe it is around 300 pages. Let me just check. Yeah, it's around 306 pages. So Ian McEwan, a lot of people have a bit of an issue with him, and I do have a lot of respect for him, because when you read this, like when you read a lot of his novels, his intelligence shines through on the page. He's very, very intelligent, and he has a lot of very perceptive things to say. The only issues that I kind of had with this book is in some elements he was fighting a losing battle, because this is a novel. And I know that he went to a lot of extent to do a lot of research about maybe current AI. He did a lot of research into 1980s politics, and he tried to ground that into the novel so that it had this sense of being realistic, even though it was an alternative universe where everything was kind of switched. So in this 80s, Margaret Thatcher doesn't win the Falklands War. Tony Benn is assassinated, becomes the new Prime Minister after Maggie and then gets assassinated. Alan Turing never died. in the 60s and 80s we get really advanced technology that we haven't got now, like driverless cars and things like that. And these Adam and Eves are these set factory limited number of robots that come into fruition. And a lot of issues start happening around this idea of intellectual consciousness that is artificially constructed. So everything's not as rosy as it seems. It's almost bordering on dystopian. But to make this world plausible, he goes into a lot of detail of maths and physics and what Alan Turing, exactly what he would have been able to achieve if he wasn't here. And exactly all these 80s politics, but in a very twisted, warped side of the coin way. Things that didn't happen, but grounding them in things that did happen. But then making it futuristic, even though it's the past. So all of this stuff for me was just very, very jarring and didn't make for an enjoyable novel reading experience. I know so much effort went into this and I respect that. But there was big sections where he's trying to debate this intellectual intelligence through the voice of Alan Turing, who's explaining extreme maths and physics concepts that as a reader I don't want. These are not particularly subjects I'm passionate about. I mean, AI is very intriguing to me, but maths and physics and the complicated engineering side of things isn't for me. And when I read a novel, I don't want a lot of heavy academic jargon either. So I found that very difficult. And also, there is a touching upon of different things in this novel that kind of overlap with Jeanette Winterson, but she created this novel and this story, and she raised these questions in a very literary way, and he's raised these in almost a non-fiction-esque style at times. They deal with similar concepts, like I've just mentioned before, about things like how far do we take these robots and what are we using them for, and that kind of idea of the sex robots. But particularly in this novel, when it raises that issue about sex and robots and AI and that kind of thing, I found that harder to stomach in this novel for some strange reason than I did in Jeanette's. There's a section in this book, which I will not ruin for you, it really disturbed me. I really wasn't happy with it. And the two main protagonists, Charlie and Miranda. So Charlie lives in a flat below Miranda in London somewhere. I'm not very good at the geography of London, sorry. And he really, really likes Miranda, and he really wants a relationship to work with Miranda, and he buys himself one of the first Adams to try and impress her. And she is a very deplorable character in some ways. I'm not sure about her the whole way through, and the book doesn't really focus on that. It kind of the crux of the story, it kind of the meat of the story in the middle, we're really questioning how far Adam the robot's a victim, how far Charlie's a victim, what Miranda's doing. And then that kind of just, we start going into this discussion about AI, Alan Turing, all this other stuff, and then that gets lost, and it's almost like Ian McEwan just kind of brushes that under the carpet and kind of says, we'll leave all this conflict we have around Miranda to the side. Let's just smooth it over. Let's just say she's all right for now. And I wasn't satisfied with that. Wasn't satisfied with the ending either. So there are bits of a plot here, but they are heavily interspersed with a lot of very brain-trying paragraphs about really intelligent, difficult things around AI and maths and physics that I just wasn't in the mood for. I just couldn't connect with on a novel level. So I just gave this a 3 out of 5 stars as well. It's written very well. I do still respect Ian McEwan, and I do want to get through his backlog of books. But overall, a lot of people say he has hits and he has misses, and I think a lot of people will put this on the miss pile. But there we go. And then the next book I read was while I was away at Iceland. I managed to finish it within my 3 days, interspersed with all the other trips we did, so that was quite good going. And that was Birdsong by Sebastian Faulks. Now this is a chunky book as well. This is around 500 pages. So this is set in a few different kind of time zones. So it starts off in 1910 when Stephen visits a French city or village, because when he lives in the UK he works in the textile industry, and they want to make a partnership with the French textile industry, so he goes over there and stays at a house with a local family with the husband that works in the textile industry to find out a little bit more and to take that home with him. When he goes to France, he falls in love with the wife of the kind of family he's staying with, who is in an unhappy marriage with her husband. They have a bit of a steamy affair. Then we go to kind of 1914 to 1918, when Stephen has to go and fight in World War One. So then we have quite a lot about his time in war and how dire that was, and we also have interspersed in that war segment of the novel a few bits from the perspective of Jack, who is somebody who lived in the UK, in Lincolnshire or somewhere like that. And he works as a tunneler, so he has to tunnel underground and try and find out where the camps are, and it's quite a very dangerous job. So we learn a lot about that in the novel as well. Towards the end of the novel, we learn what has happened to Elizabeth. Stephen kind of finds out through Elizabeth's sister, Janine. I want to say Janine. And then we have kind of a 70s, kind of in the future, we jump to the 70s section, which focuses on Elizabeth, who is Stephen's granddaughter. Lots going on in this novel. I think some of the other sections were cleverly constructed to kind of break up the war segments, because I do enjoy a war novel. However, the main chunk of this novel is very much about the atrocities of war. Now, maybe it's because the way I've been brought up now, war has been very much on the curriculum at school. Novels have been very focused on war. As I was growing up, there was lots of these kind of novels to read. Maybe in some ways have been slightly desensitised, because at the beginning of this novel, Sebastian Faulks kind of does an introduction, talks about how when he was younger he didn't know much about World War One, and kind of through this character of Elizabeth, who's trying to find out what happened to Stephen, it's almost reflecting how he felt that he had a duty to find out about World War One, because he didn't really know as much as he should have done. And he goes there and he feels really affected by it, and he says we shouldn't forget. And I think that's been achieved. I mean, he wrote this in the 90s. I think now we're in 2020, it's definitely been achieved that my generation fully understand about World War One and World War Two. I mean, I studied a lot about the inner politics of what made both wars occur. And I have probably been saturated with a lot of war fiction. And I enjoy it, but I did find some of this a little bit trying, purely because it's very depressing. The tunnelling was very depressing. The sections that dealt with the tunnelling really created this sense of claustrophobia for me as well when I was reading it. And I know Elizabeth's story in the 70s was kind of to present a bit more of a lighter relief, but I didn't really enjoy her sections very much. I found them a little bit boring, and I didn't find her a very interesting character. And women in this novel are kind of presented as making stupid decisions and getting themselves pregnant, which is a theme that spans throughout all of the time period with the different women, which I didn't really appreciate. It's kind of women are presented as a little bit in this book. That was a bit questionable for me. They weren't fully fleshed out, and they were just women who got themselves into this situation. And you can argue with Elizabeth that she kind of felt empowered and she didn't care that she got herself into that situation. She was just going to raise her child as she saw fit, which is fair enough. But then there's a kind of a segment where Stephen, towards the end of the war segment, starts to create a relationship with Janine, who's Isabel's sister. And I kind of felt like that was a bit of a consolation prize, and I felt a bit sorry for Janine. It was kind of a rushed section. It was kind of just, they tried to make a tenderness develop there that wasn't really there. Overall, I enjoyed this book. I just think that maybe it hasn't aged as well as it should have done, because my mum personally loved this book when it came out. And this is my first Sebastian Faulks, and my mum adores Sebastian Faulks novels. So I know that this is the second in a series of 3 novels that focus around France. So I might read the other 2. I'm definitely not going to give up on him, because I think the writing was beautiful. I just think maybe this maybe how I was feeling at the time. I was distracted, I was on holiday, I wanted to do other things as well. Maybe it just hasn't aged as well, or maybe I just wasn't in the right frame of mind when I read this, but I decided to only give it 3 out of 5 stars because it didn't really give me the oomph that I really wanted from it, unfortunately. And then the last book is the Gustav Sonata by Rose Tremaine. So I literally finished this last night. It's a very short book, to be honest. It's around 300 pages, but the way it's written is really satisfying for me because, I'll give you an example. It breaks up into paragraphs quite well. I like a novel that breaks up its sections into good, chunky bits of paragraphs, because sometimes when they're all from the right to the top to right to the bottom of the page, psychologically, sometimes it just makes it feel like you're trudging through the text a little bit more. I don't know, maybe that's just me. Anyway, so this, set in Switzerland, in a town called, I can never ever pronounce it. Let me just have a little look. In a town called Matzlingen. Anyway, so it's set in Switzerland. And this also, similar to Birdsong, kind of goes through different time periods. So we have around the time pre-World War II to the outbreak of World War II, which focuses on Emily and Eric. Pre-war in Switzerland, where they have this budding relationship, and then it kind of goes through what happens in their relationship, and they have a child called Gustav, which hence the title. And so we lose Eric just after kind of World War II, and then it goes through Gustav and Emily's relationship as mother and son. Then when he's quite young, Gustav meets Anton, who he develops a kind of very intense and passionate friendship with, and we go through their lives together. We go through the trials and tribulations of Anton's talent in kind of performing piano, being a pianist, and his aspirations to become a pianist, and what happens with that. And then Gustav kind of later on in the book kind of finds out what happened to his dad, kind of reconciles himself with his relationship with his mum. It's just very, very beautifully written. All of the sections and all of the different time jumps I really invested in equally, and I really enjoyed. Some of this writing is so beautiful. I love how there was this subtlety of kind of passion between Gustav and Anton, but it was left ambiguous. So it kind of focused more on their friendship and their devotion as opposed to a standard romance, which I loved. All of the characters you could kind of sympathise with in their own ways. They were just written so beautifully. Oh, it was just very, very, very well constructed. And I think it is one that will linger with you afterwards. The title, the Gustav Sonata, or whatever, Sonata, is literally kind of given in the very last page when Anton kind of spends his life with Gustav and says, and he kind of reinvigorates his passion for playing the piano and composing, and he decides to compose this kind of piece of music and name it after Gustav, which is a beautiful end to the novel. It's just very well constructed, and it just stays with you, and the characters aren't overstated, they're very faulted, but there's a lot of development from them. I just loved being in this novel. I just loved reading it. It was so quick to get through. So I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars because I just really enjoyed it, and it was just such a pleasure to read. So that's it for today. Sorry that it was really long and waffly, but thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with a brand new video. Bye now.